Good morning and welcome to Chemspec Digital 2021 and the next session in the Agrochemical Lecture Theatre. Before I introduce our next speaker, please note the presentation will be recorded to make it available for on-demand viewing. I'd also like to invite the audience to write questions into the chat function so we can have them ready for the Q&A session afterwards. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to introduce to you to Dr. David Calvert from iFormulate, who will be presenting sustainability in agrochemicals. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Jason, and welcome everyone to this presentation. Thanks for giving up your time over the next 30 to 45 minutes to listen to me talk about what is a rather broad-ranging topic of sustainability and agrochemicals. So what do I hope to achieve over the next 30 minutes? Well, I'm going to do some introductions, so please bear with me. It is our duty to introduce myself and the company. We'll then try and get to what sounds simple. Well, what does sustainability mean, and what are the drivers towards sustainability? And I've put agrochemical issues in there, but we shouldn't lose track of the benefits of agrochemicals, and I'll try to emphasize those. But we'll look in maybe a couple of specific areas around the manufacture of agrochemicals and looking at fertilizers and the use of agrochemicals and some of the sustainability issues there. We'll then focus briefly on a couple of topics that I thought would be of interest. So we'll talk a little bit about clean ammonia and what that really means and where that could be going. And then the very topical subject of carbon credits and trading, which over the last 12 months has seen an immense growth with regard to agriculture. And then we'll give you the opportunity to see where you could learn more. And then obviously there's time for questions and answers. And as Jason has said, if you do have any questions going along, please put them in the chat function and Jason will relay them afterwards and we'll try and answer them as best we can. So as I said, we needed to talk a little bit about iFormulate. What is this company, iFormulate Limited? Well, we were formed almost exactly 9 years ago by myself and Jim Bullock. We're a company which combines diverse experience. You can see on the screen there the areas that we work in and the areas where we have lots of experience. And in many ways, we also, when we don't know the answer, we have a network of associates that we use. But when I say what do we do? Well, the majority of work is consultancy projects in formulation science and technology. So we work across all the sectors that encompasses, which can be pharmaceuticals, it could be healthcare, it could be cosmetics, inks and coatings. And then obviously today we're talking about agrochemicals. Our projects can be as simple as formulation isn't simple, or else we wouldn't have a business, I guess, but could be as simple as, well, we have a problem with our formulation. How can you help us to solve that? Or we want to develop a new formulation, or we want to evaluate technologies in formulation. Or we want to look for a new technology. That's the majority of our work, which is done under NDA. We have a skills platform where we develop and deliver training for people both under our banner and under other people's banner. And then we've worked on a few strategic projects, and quite a while ago we worked here in the UK to develop the business case and do industry consultation for what has become the National Formulation Centre. So we've done the introductions. For the scope of this talk, I'm actually going to talk about agrochemicals in quite a wide sense. I'm going to talk about plant protection products, and that can mean synthetic pesticides. So we're talking about herbicides, we're talking about fungicides, insecticides, molluscides, etc. But also, we shouldn't get away from sustainability, also biopesticides being there. And if you want, sometimes the word biopesticides has gone a little bit out of fashion. Sometimes they're called biocontrol agents. And well, there are varying definitions for those, but they could be originating from nature, directly or indirectly, or identical to nature if they're synthesized. They're used to manage pests, weeds, and diseases in agriculture. And they achieve sustainability goals that consumers demand for food safety, human health, and protection of the environment. That's a summary of a definition from an organization called the International Biocontrol Manufacturers Association. And you can find much more details about biopesticides on their website. There are also biostimulants, which they stimulate natural processes in plants to try and help them become better against things such as drought, for example, stresses, and they help to improve the yield. And again, there's an organization called the European Biostimulants Industry Council, and you look on their website and you can see what the definition is that they give. And then there are fertilizers, and we all probably know what fertilizers are, but they provide really nutrients to improve the yield, but they're extremely, extremely significant. So if that, for the purpose of this presentation, is what I might call agrochemicals, what on earth do I mean by sustainability? Okay, well, you probably immediately have your own definition of what sustainability is. It possibly could be argued it went back as far as 1962 when a lady called Rachel Carson published her book called Silent Spring, which started really in earnest the debate about pesticides, but she never actually used the word sustainability. So what could you mean? And there's a definition here which came from Brundtland of the United Nations, and he talked about what development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that definition actually is used very, very regularly, even now. So Brundtland, he developed that and presented that in a report called Our Common Future, which he delivered to the General Assembly in 1987. And as we go through this presentation, you'll see how the United Nations has become quite significant in driving this agenda. It's not been driven by a government. It's not necessarily been driven by non-governmental organizations or any particular consumer group, but I believe the United Nations has tried to pull all of this together and try to get some commonality around what we mean by sustainability. So what's actually driving sustainability? Okay, well, there's obviously, it's being driven by stakeholders. Again, a word that's thrown around a lot. What do you really mean by stakeholders in this definition? Well, consumers will talk about sustainability. They'll also instantly talk an awful lot about price. And the two don't necessarily go hand in hand, although that gap is changing and going the other way around. But they're definitely driving those. They do look for sustainable products. Interestingly, and what's pushing companies an awful lot even more are investors are actually looking at sustainability and how do they invest sustainably. And there are many ways that they might look to invest sustainability. If we think about things called the Carbon Disclosure Project and how people are doing with relation to climate change, then they'll look at those and they'll look at the ESG type of issues, which is environmental, social, and governance. And companies are more and more delivering reports that are publicly available for scrutiny. So investors are quite significant. Non-governmental organizations, well, they've been around for a while, as we know, and they're establishing, well, they're not establishing, they are very credible in many ways. You've got people like the Rainforest Alliance, people like the Forest Stewardship Council, people like Fair Trade, people like Greenpeace. A number of those actually have started to publish how they categorize various pesticides. And they'll start to move it forward, and people will look for their recommendation, their badge. It's not quite a recommendation, but they'll look for their badge on lots of products. What makes people really sit up and listen in companies is regulators. So if you're regulated against that, then you start to see some issues. And we've seen in the EU, we have something called we have standard regulation, I suppose. The sustainable use of pesticides is in the EU. But then we also have something, they've started to look at the European Green Deal and Farm to Fork. And Farm to Fork now has stated a 2030 target of reducing the use and risk of chemical and more hazardous pesticides by 50%. 50%. They've got another target to reduce nutrient losses by at least another 50% and fertilizer use by at least 20%. So some pretty challenging targets there. And they're also looking to develop and support organic farming, and they've got a goal that by 2030, 25% of total farmland in the EU will be used for organic farming. Again, there are different definitions of organic farming and different ways of accrediting that, but that's pretty significant. And then if we go across the pond, from my point of view, and we go look at the US, they've started to put a legislative agenda on climate change, and they've said that they want to decarbonize the food and agriculture sector and leverage agriculture to remove carbon dioxide from the air and store it in the ground. Now, what does that mean? Okay, that's quite an interesting challenge, but we'll come to that and the carbon credits in later on in this presentation. But as I touched on earlier, we've got intergovernmental organizations, and the United Nations has been very key in driving it forward, and they've published what they call their 15 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And these we've seen companies start to report against. So what are those goals? Well, on this slide, you'll see an extract from the SDG website, and you'll see the 17, actually, apologies, I can't count, but the 17 SDGs there. And you can pick your own favorite, but there are a number there and there are a website. I need to say, by using this graphic, that obviously there isn't, the UN does not necessarily support the views that I'm saying, or the officers or the governments that are members of the EU. It's fairly clear. A lot of this is my own views in many ways. But they've got a number of goals there. But of all of those, which are the ones that are really relevant to agriculture? So I've picked out what I think is the most relevant, and I start with SDG 2, which talks about zero hunger. Let's just go back a little bit. So zero hunger. Without agrochemicals, we won't have zero hunger, and we can't get away from that, and therefore they are key, and that includes fertilizers as well. There was Greta Thunberg spoke yesterday, I think, at a conference preceding COP, and she said she used a number of quotes from some governmental leaders and then put afterwards blah, 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 and said something about it's all words, but no actual action. I think that the SDGs are different, and zero hunger is an easy thing to say, but if you want to go into the detail of zero hunger, then there are lots of details and it cascades down as you would expect. So, for example, by 2030, they want to double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, in particular women, indigenous peoples, family farmers, fishers, including through secure and equal access to land. They want by 2030 to ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agricultural practices that increase productivity and production, etc., etc. There's much more detail on all of these. And that leads down to some very specifics. And what's really interesting is when you see company reports, they actually cite these, but then give real actions as to what they're doing in terms of these SDGs. Clean water. Okay, where does agrochemicals? Well, they talk about sustainably increasing water use efficiency across all sectors and ensure sustainable withdrawals and supply of fresh water. Those withdrawals are key in many areas, that you don't want to be taking fresh water and wasting it. You need the fresh water. Sustainable consumption and production is where all agrochemical companies can make a contribution. And in terms of, let's just have a look, they, by 2020, on Sustainable Development Goal, they want to achieve the environmentally sound management of chemicals and all waste throughout their life cycle in accordance with agreed international frameworks, and reduce their release to air, water, and soil to minimize their adverse impacts on human health and the environment. And that goes down, and companies are reporting against that SDG. Climate change goes without saying, but we are going to dwell on a couple of key issues around climate change. And many companies do report what their emissions are and what they are actually doing with regard to climate change. And there's something called the Carbon Disclosure Project, where you can pick up a lot of details from companies. And then life below water, obviously the impact of agrochemicals in trying to reduce marine pollution. There is a lot of focus there, a bit too topical perhaps, about microplastics, but there is a lot of emphasis there, but that doesn't get away that agrochemicals can obviously have an effect there. And life on land in terms of deforestation, but also in terms of biodiversity and the impact of agrochemicals on there. So those are the ones that I would pick out and where a lot of companies in this sector are reporting against. Again, just to highlight, without agrochemicals, zero hunger will not be achieved. So there are some incredible benefits of agrochemicals. But there are issues. We can't get away from that. So where are the issues with regard to sustainability? Well, we can look at the raw materials and what the source of those raw materials are. Many of those are petrochemical based, so there are obviously issues around that. Natural resources, we may think that, well, that's great, but often they're mined. So you have issues around mining that. You then can have issues around bio resources, which people might say, well, that's an instant solution. But as we saw with palm oil, that doesn't necessarily lead to sustainability. And that, of course, has been addressed by the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. The manufacture of well, all chemicals, I think needs to be said, is probably energy intensive, and it just varies in their degree. The use of renewable energy, we're seeing more and more is being used. The manufacturer has emissions in terms of gaseous. We've talked about liquid emissions, and there is waste. But we're seeing how these things are changing. There are some specific, and we're seeing companies where they use renewable energy to manufacture their product, and they also then biosource. Something like bioethanol is becoming more and more common, and people are using that as a starting material for certain things such as surfactants and adjuvants that are used in agrochemicals. Probably wanted to touch really on ammonia as being a key example that you might say in terms of carbon issues. So ammonia is the biggest issue. The figures say that 1.6 of global greenhouse gases come from the manufacture of fertilizer, and of that, roughly 1% of global greenhouse gases comes from the manufacture of ammonia by the Haber-Bosch process. And we can see here, I'm not going to talk you through all of that. It's a fairly simple reaction for a chemist. It's nitrogen and hydrogen producing ammonia. But it's how you start it off. So you steam reform methane, and then you take air and you purify air. And it's in these two, steam reforming, and in these processes, you just need to look at the temperatures and look at the pressures and the amount of energy that is needed to actually produce that. So that becomes key. In terms of the use of agrochemicals, and we will come back to the manufacture of ammonia, agrochemicals can be overused. There is no doubt about that. And what happens is that they can run off into waterways called eutrophication, and also cause problems to life in the waterways. It also produces waste, and I feel this often gets disregarded in all areas, not just in agrochemicals, but the waste of a product, all of that going off into the waterways, doesn't just mean that final product is wasted. What about all that energy and all of those raw materials that have gone into making that product? That's all been wasted as well. So waste is definitely not a real issue. So we have also spray drift can be an issue when applying agrochemicals. That's when it doesn't actually reach the target in terms of the block. And then we can also have it getting to the right place, which is talking about targeting. And does it get to the right pest, or is it too general? What can we do in terms of formulation to extend the use? So that can become key. And then also, what about the impact on beneficials? And we've seen all of the controversy around neonicotinoids and their impact on bees. But this last issue comes down to, and we hear a lot about precision agriculture, and it comes down to how you can change practices and change products to actually help with that. Okay, I hope you can still hear me. Let's just see what happens in terms of that. So yeah, impact on beneficials. Just need to go back now to this ammonia production, and we talked a little bit about how that uses up so much energy. So what are people trying to do with ammonia production? Well, the traditional one is called brown ammonia, but there is a term being used which is clean ammonia. And that really talks about, it's split into two. So you have blue ammonia. When people talk about blue ammonia, what they mean is that the emissions from the ammonia production are actually captured, utilized, and stored. So carbon capture, utilization, and storage is not cheap. And the agrochemical and ammonia production isn't going to do this all on their own, but they're often combined with power plants or with cement plants, where they actually then take the carbon dioxide emissions from all of those and start to store them. And they're often actually, ironically, used for enhanced oil recovery, but then they can be used for other issues. We then have green ammonia, which is, rather than taking methane, they take water and they use electrolysis to split the water into hydrogen and oxygen. The efficiency of that is uneconomic at present. That doesn't mean it can't be done, but it's uneconomic at present. And then, of course, you can, if you start to look and start to use either wind power or solar panel to use actually the renewable energy. And there is within ammonia the use of it as a fuel, so that in terms of particularly in shipping, they're used to shipping ammonia around the world, so they can also develop fuel cells which can use ammonia as a fuel. So that's quite an interesting development. I think it will be very difficult to see ammonia as a fuel in cars. I think hydrogen will probably be there, but you don't know. If people start to get all of these put together, then you start to develop, and this is a 2050 vision for nitrogen fertilizer production, where you use green energy, you use electrolysis of water, you get your oxygen here, which is then used from the ammonia to make nitric acid, and then you can make ammonium nitrate using the nitric acid there. It's sort of a closed loop, but it will need a fair bit of work. So if we go on then to, okay, that's where we're trying to look on ammonia. What's this thing called carbon credits and trading? Well, carbon credits are all about, and if you go back to the Biden quote, it's all about farming practices used to capture carbon in soil. And it's all about using different practices that capture the carbon to try and build the organic matter which is in the soil. And farmers know how good that is. And it has been claimed that by raising the soil organic matter in each hectare by just 0.1%, you can sequester 8.9 tons of CO2 per year. So that would be quite a goal to get, but how do you actually, what are the farming practices you need to do? Well, there's something called no-till, which is not doing any tillage at the time of harvest or the termination of one crop, or the next cash crop in the rotation. So they're not digging up the ground. If you go back to a small gardeners, there's a trend called no dig, and they will be doing no dig. Cover crops is when you use you plant something in between your growing season of the farmer's cash crop, and that is there to improve the soil health and reduce erosion, improve soil fertility, and reduce soil compaction. So the typical type of cover crops that they talk about are tillage radish, grasses like cereal, rye, and legumes. So they use the cover crops, but there's also the optimized use of the products, which is where you use the right product at the right place at the right time in the right amount, and the fertilizer people use the terminology 4Rs. In the carbon credits that we're starting to see, what happens is that the grower receives an annual payment for credits, which are then traded on an open exchange. And we've seen in the EU, the European Emissions Trading Scheme called the ETS, which has used that for power plants and other emitters. But they're starting to develop them in agriculture. And they also are used by purchasers to offset their own emissions, because people wish to show that they are net zero. So the carbon schemes that you start to see now, there are what I would call trading platforms. There are organizations called Nori and Indico. Now, some interesting innovation in here. Nori, for example, are developing their own cryptocurrency with blockchain technology, which is intended to stop double counting of carbon sequestering. Indigo is also developing their own scheme, and it is growing that and has a significant number of corporate buyers. In terms of rewards, they in 2019 talked about $15 per ton. Then I would say you have the company-backed schemes, and you can look at the names there. They are big companies, and in many ways, they've launched these schemes where they will purchase the credits from the grower to actually offset their own emissions. Question that may be coming, well, how long do they need to practice these ones? They're commonly talking about 10 years. So the farmer needs to practice the emissions and the practices for a period of 10 years. What many of the schemes also talk about is that the farmer doesn't just get a reward from the actual carbon credit that the payment is that they receive every year, but also they'll see an improvement in their soil quality and therefore an improvement in their yield. And that is in many ways more significant even than the cash payment for the carbon credits. So there's much more about that. And if you want to learn some more, we've written a report with IHS Markit on sustainability in agrochemicals, which is going to be published imminently. So we're in the process of the last edit. If you're interested in that report, then the contact details on the screen, but Alan Bullion will be able to let you know once it's finally been published, which, as I say, would be, I would expect, within the next month or so, and we'll be able to give you more details of what's in that report. If you want to learn some more about what iFormulate does, then my contact details are on the screen there, as is the contact details for Jim Bullock. I do hope you've been able to hear me after my video's gone out. So at that stage, Jason, I'm going to stop speaking now.
Thank you so much, David, for that informative session. It was really good and really interesting to hear. We've now reached our Q&A session. So if I can ask the audience to put their questions into the chat function in the top right-hand corner of your screens. Those will come through to us and we can then moderate them to David. We do have one question so far, and the question that I've had at the moment is, David, in 5 years, what do you think is going to happen in the field of sustainability in agrochemicals?
Okay, sustainability is not going to go away. It is, you're going to see more and more companies talking about the SDGs. Be interesting to see what comes out of COP27 in Glasgow later this year. They will report more and more about that. We will see an increase in the carbon credit scheme in agriculture, there's no doubt. We will see an increase in regulation. I think on the positive side, I think some of the carbon sequestration projects, I think we'll see a couple of those at large scale. There's one in particular in Canada, I think will come off, and they'll be driven, unsurprisingly, by regulators, and Canada's got some specific ways of regulating carbon emissions. And I think we'll see smart agriculture. I think people will, look to use synthetic pesticides and biopesticides and fertilizers much smarter. We'll just use them better.
Okay, thank you for that. It doesn't look like we've had any more questions come in, so that would mean that we've reached the end of our session. And I would like to thank you, David. Thank you very much for your talk and your topic. It was very interesting. I would also like to thank our audience. So thank you for listening, and continue enjoying Chemspec Digital 2021. And I wish everybody a great day further. Thank you.
Thank you.